Hello everyone, this is Mopar 3030 on YouTube. Making one of my first informational videos here. I decided to talk about the Mopar front suspension because it's something that I think is pretty misunderstood. At least some of the components, people don't really understand how they work and what their function is. And also for the people who think that old muscle cars like these can't handle, and you just expect them to handle like crap all the time, which I don't believe. I've put in just a couple of upgrades to this front end on my 1970 Duster, and it has made a noticeable improvement in the handling. Can't say it corners like a modern Beamer or something like that, but it's much better than it was before, and there's still lots of room for improvement beyond that as well. So get a little closer here. You can see I have, this is a 1970 Duster, but it has the 73 up front brake assembly with the single piston calipers and the larger bolt pattern, stud pattern for the wheels. Matches the larger cars, 5 on 4.5 inch bolt pattern. So let's get started here. Let's go over components somewhat in order of importance. So I got some glare from the sun here, it's kind of tough to see. So, oh man, let's see if I can move this. So this piece, you can just kind of see the shadow of it. There you go. This piece here, some may know what it's called. It is the Strut Rod, or sometimes referred to in older factory terminology as the drag link. Basically what this does is it absorbs the force imparted on the whole assembly, basically on the spindle, which is the part that connects from up here down to the lower control arm down here. Basically, when you hit the brakes, okay, you have your wheel spinning this way going forward. When you hit the brakes, you're putting friction force on the rotor, obviously, but that creates a force on the caliper that wants to make the whole thing go like this. And if you didn't have your front strut rod here, the whole assembly would basically just like that. It would just collapse under the force of braking, and your car would go all over the place. You wouldn't be able to keep an alignment, and it wouldn't work. Your car basically won't drive without your front strut rod. And the important thing about these, when you're talking about having a performance Mopar that you like to, you know, have fun with, drive a little fast, take corners hard, it's very critical the length of this strut rod, where it goes from the lower control arm down here up to the front of the K-frame. Now, for me, I wanted to talk more about this because I just got finished. It's not totally buttoned up yet, but I just put this front end back together with, see if I can get in there to show you, some Hotchkiss sport suspension, polyurethane lower control arm bushings. Yes, you can kind of see the end of it right up in there, and also their greasable lower control arm pivot shaft kit. As you can can see, I haven't put it in yet, but there's a hole for a Zerk fitting so that you can grease the pivot shaft to keep the urethane bushing from squeaking. And it's been mentioned an issue with using these bushings as opposed to the factory style rubber bushings is that they don't have the ability to hold the lower control arm in place from basically sliding backwards like this. That's what people claim. And the factory rubber bushings do hold it in place because they're pressed in with an interference fit into, you know, the front end of the lower control arm, and it has, you know, it has two sleeves with a rubber bushing in between, and those don't move at all. There's no, you know, just like most rubber bushings, it just you know, you have to wait till the car is at ride height to tighten it because the bushing can't spin around in where it's mounted. So when you have the pivot shaft in there and the bushing is, you know, everything is pressed in and whatnot, the pivot shaft cannot rotate and it can't slide up and down on the bushing. Now people think that's a good thing. I guess it kinda is if you don't really know what you're doing in the first place. But all of that, talking about the lower control arm moving up and forward and backwards like this, that comes down again to your critical strut rod component. Okay? If your strut rod length is wrong, doesn't matter if you have rubber bushings or polyurethane or nylon, whatever the heck. I mean, you can get some pretty interesting stuff. Check out firmfeel.com. They've got some really cool stuff. But if your lower control arm is basically bound or is binding where this is too long, and it will basically push. If you have rubber bushings and the back part can't slide, it'll bend the lower control arm back this way. Okay? So that's still bad. You don't want that, because I had that happen before on this same car, because on the front strut rod bushings I installed some just from a general you know, front end rebuild kit, and the bushings, they're not the same as the ones on the B and E body cars. They're thinner, they're smaller. These ones in here right now are made by Moog. They're the Problem Solver bushings, and they're specific for the A body cars only. I discovered those a while after, kind of too late after, because it's kind of what caused the need for this repair in the first place. So what it was doing, it was pushing this end of the lower control arm back, just like I was saying, and that basically, that takes away your ability to dial in as much positive caster. I think positive, I always mix those up. But yeah, basically caster is where you have the spindle axis inclined back this way, so that when you turn, it kind of lifts up the car a little bit on the axis of steering, so that you it basically helps give a little bit better road feel and helps the steering wheel return to center more easily, and you know, makes it less like, you know, typical factory Mopars. You can just kind of steer them all over the place with one finger and not you know, not really feel anything, any resistance. So that was pushing my lower control arm back, tilting it back like this, and over time it ended up pounding the crap out of the rubber lower control arm bushing that I had in there. Just about a week ago, I was driving down the highway in this car, and it was a developing problem that I had noticed, but it really got worse at that point, and it was pretty scary. I hit my brakes because you know, as usual, I was in a little bit of traffic, and some people decided they needed to slam on the brakes, so I hit my brakes at about 80 miles an hour, and it jerked the steering wheel to the left pretty hard. Like, I had to react pretty fast and, you know, steer back to the right so that I wouldn't veer off the road. But that really, you know, after that happened, I got under here and was looking at everything, because that's not supposed to happen. When you hit the brakes, your car is just supposed to keep going forward and slow down. It's not supposed to pull any direction, left or right. So I got under here, and I'll try to put a picture that I have in this video. Obviously, you're not going to see it now because I've already replaced it, but the rubber bushing was entirely worn out, and the pivot shaft was completely offset. Like it was instead of being like, the shaft is supposed to be, like I said, inside the bushing. So pretend my finger is it, and then outside of that there's a sleeve, and then there's a rubber bushing, and then there's the outer sleeve that goes into the control arm. What happened was the rubber was completely basically just mangled, and the pivot shaft, instead of being centered in the bushing, was completely over to the right, and it was rubbing against. So it's basically the outer and the inner sleeves were just rubbing metal on metal, and the rest of the bushing had kind of just squeezed over to this side and started coming out, and it was a bad situation. So what to take away from this? Basically, get your strut rod alignment right. The length is critical. Something that I've actually noticed putting these urethane bushings in, you probably saw when I put it over here before, there is a slight, maybe just barely 1/16 of an inch of space. I can't really get it anymore. Oh, there you go. You kind of see it. There's a little bit of space from the mounting, or that kind of retaining face on the pivot shaft that you can see butts up against the K-frame there. On the left, it's hitting the K-frame. On the right is the urethane bushing. You can see in there, and there's a little bit of space. That happened after I torqued down the pivot shaft nut all the way, and that tells me that even with the correct bushings in the front, these strut rods are still a tiny bit too long. And what's the solution for that? Well, you gotta go to the aftermarket and get some of those fancy adjustable strut rods. Those have typically, you know, that bushing section is kind of the same, but then right after the bushing right here, it's you basically have like a kind of like a rod and clevis setup, and then a threaded rod, so that not only can you change and adjust the length of the strut rod, you know, to match your suspension correctly, but it also, because there's a flexible joint up here, it allows the strut rod to move easier with the suspension and not bind up on these bushings. Because when the whole suspension moves up and down like this, it's basically, it's kind of you know, it's kind of just like twisting or forcing these bushings, you know. That's like the only thing that's holding it in there. So the strut rod is kind of has to work against that friction with the rubber, whereas the adjustable ones with the joint here takes away that kind of issue. And you know, I'm at this point, I don't really have the cash to get those, and really the amount of space in there isn't that bad. It's just barely enough to know that I need adjustable strut rods and that they're a bit too long, but I don't think it's enough to actually make any issues getting the alignment done or anything like that, hopefully. I still got to do the other side of the car and then take it to the alignment shop and see what we can do. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you're concerned about what people are saying about installing polyurethane lower control arm bushings on Mopars. It's all about the strut rod. That's it. If you get an adjustable strut rod and you adjust that out to be properly locating this end of the lower control arm on this side, attaching to the spindle, you won't have any problems, because the lower control arm bushing isn't supposed to support the lower control arm in that fashion anyway. It's not supposed to keep it from moving back and forth this way. That's just kind of like a byproduct of the rubber bushings. And yeah, people who are thinking like, oh, but what about, you know, what about forces like, you know, going over bumps and stuff, pushing things backwards? Again, any forces imparted, because, you know, obviously your wheel is mounted here, and everything goes through the spindle first before it, you know, any of the forces go to the rest of the suspension parts. So if the strut rod is, you know, proper length and it's tight and it's properly supporting this end of the lower control arm, the lower control arm isn't going to move at all, because there's nothing back here that pushes on it. It's only up here where the wheel is, and the strut rod is attached directly as far forward as you can, I mean, as far out as you can get, pretty much, with the constraints of the design. So any force that's gonna go this way or back this way, it's gonna be absorbed right here by the strut rod. So it shouldn't matter what that is. The whole purpose of that bushing is supposed to keep the lower control arm in position this way, so that it rotates, stays stiff, and then it rotates about an axis and doesn't move forward or back like this. Okay? Because when you're cornering, that's something else though. When you're cornering, you're putting, okay, say you're turning, you're making a hard right turn. So when you're turning, the angle of your tires, the cornering forces, is going to be putting a force this way on the lower part. It's going to be twisting it, you know, bending it like this. Or it's going to be trying to do that. The forces are trying to be bending it like that. So the lower control arm bushing holds that in place and keeps the arm from wanting to go under like that. And same thing with the upper ones. They keep it solidly here so that it doesn't try to pull out or move back in like this. So that's pretty much the deal with those. I think I'm going to make another little video here about the general suspension upgrades, but hope it was informative. Hope you guys got some good information, and yeah, take care. Happy Moparing.